Hello, welcome to our session. This is Challenging the Status Quo. I'm here with, well, I should introduce myself first. I'm Weston Sprott. I'm a trombonist at the Metropolitan Opera. And to my left is Joyce Griggs, who's Executive Vice President and Provost at Manhattan School of Music. Thank you.
I have a fan club.
Go, Joyce. Our Guzelimian, who's Provost and Dean at the Juilliard School, and Jamal Rossi, who's the Dean at the Eastman School of Music. So we had a little bit of discussion prior to coming out here and putting this together a few weeks ago to try to facilitate the conversation. And I have a list of questions that I want to share and ask and get everyone else's opinion here on the stage. But I want you to remember, of course, that we have this Slido technology. So if you look over here, you see slido.com, #SphinxConnect. Feel free to write in your questions there, and they will pop up on this tablet that's right next to me. So I have an idea of which questions are really popular in the room. If you see a question that you like, feel free to hit the like button, and the more that a particular question is liked, it will go up the queue. And so I'll have a feeling that this is something that perhaps 10 people want an answer to that question. And the one thing I can tell you from the brief conversations I've had with the people here on the panel is that I think you will be able to get really honest, sincere, and straightforward answers. These are people who are looking forward to answering difficult questions and really making improvements in the field, so please feel comfortable to ask exactly what you feel. But to start the conversation, I wanted to give everyone here a chance to talk about what their respective institutions are currently doing to have a more diverse and inclusive environment at their school. So maybe we could start with Joyce.
Sure. So thank you first and foremost to Sphinx for this invitation and Weston for coordinating the panel. I arrived at the Manhattan School of Music approximately 7.5 months ago, and prior to that spent 3 years at the Cleveland Institute of Music and 15 years at the University of Illinois. So the context in which I've worked in the area of diversity and inclusion has changed dependent upon both my own personal journey as well as the mission of the school and the needs of the school and the time of the school. So my particular area, I would say, was my journey began with trying to think about a state university's mission and inclusion around bringing individuals from all backgrounds to a campus that had a land-grant mission. But now my focus has really changed to what we're all here for, which is how do we expand diversity and inclusion within the role of music and music conservatories. And so what's been incredibly rewarding to me at Manhattan School of Music is to see that this type of inclusion is not only happening through our Student Affairs Office, but also within the curriculum and the programming that we offer our students. And I look forward as the panel continues to talk a little bit more about that, both horizontal and vertical integration of what we're doing in this work.
Thank you. It's a treat to be back here. The biggest event at Juilliard in the last year is the appointment of a new president, Damien Wetzel, who is here and who'll take part in the next session. And Damien has really articulated in the strongest terms possible the growth of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging as one of the highest priorities of his leadership. And so I think we've seen a lot of good progress in the last year. Damien appointed in the president's office a manager of EDIB programs who is already energizing and synthesizing the various elements going on around the school. We have partnered very happily with the Sphinx organization, and the Sphinx Performance Academy will take place in late July, and that's something we share with a number of our fellow schools. And the third retreat session of the LEAD program will take place at Juilliard in late May. All of this is new. Historically, Juilliard has had a MAP program, a music advancement program, specifically designed to serve underserved communities since the 90s. But even in the last year, the focus of energies and efforts in MAP have doubled and redoubled, and we're actually in search mode right now for a dean of the preparatory division who oversees MAP, the Juilliard Pre-College, and a number of summer programs to take a more comprehensive view of the pipeline, so these things don't exist in isolation. And I'm proud to acknowledge that Weston has been a key figure in the past at MAP and also currently at the Juilliard Pre-College. And then programmatically, this may seem very late in the day, and it certainly is, but we added for the first time ever a History of African American Music course this past year, and that will be an ongoing part of the curriculum. It was extremely well received, highly enrolled, and with a very diverse audience of enrollees, and we're going to expand that to multiple offerings. And I think we've become more active participants in many of the wonderful processes that you've heard about at other sessions here. The Pre-College Pipeline Network, led by Walter Bittner and Stan Thompson, will be well represented at the convening next week in Atlanta for the Talent Development Program. And as I've sat and just learned, and I think a key part of being an educator is learning as much as teaching, I've just listened in awe and admiration for the efforts of PMA and learned more in Philadelphia and the BEAM program, these collective programs that provide a kind of ecosystem of support across 8 or 10 organizations, and hope to find out more about the new program in Chicago led by Adrian Thompson, because I think these programs, in close partnership with all of us, will prove to be incredibly meaningful connectors. So it's been a good year of progress. There's a lot of work to do. No one is sitting back and saying that we're remotely there, but I think we're moving forward.
Great. So first of all, good morning, and I too want to just thank AFA and the Sphinx organization for really a remarkable conference, and it is such an honor to be a part of this. The question of how are we doing, at Eastman I feel like we could say, well, we're making good progress. When you look at certain numbers, we've more than doubled the percentage of underrepresented minority students at our school. We're at 16% now. In the last 5 years, we've more than quadrupled the number of students of color in the program. So on the one hand, that's progress. On the other hand, the numbers are still so small, and it's too slow. About 10 years ago, there was a big focus, and it continues to this day, but it really amplified about 10 years ago on diversifying the faculty. And we talk about the pool of musicians out there. And one of the things that we did at that time is we looked at 10 of our peer schools, their doctorate programs, PhD and DMA, and the number of students of color in those programs was virtually zero. So the only option we had to diversify the faculty was to hire somebody already employed on somebody else's faculty or take somebody from an orchestra, but that did nothing to grow the population. So we really made a concerted effort and a commitment to say we are going to do what we can within our city to build the population and to make certain that every student has access to high quality music instruction at the highest stage. We know that to be admitted to music programs, and especially top music programs, one has to start early and they have to have extraordinary instruction. So we did exactly what Ara was talking about. We could have done this on our own, but we created a program called Rock Music. Has nothing to do with this. In Rochester, everything is rock. Rock sports, rock this, so this is rock music. So we collaborated with Hochstein School of Music and Dance. They enroll about 4,000 students. It's the Rochester Philharmonic. It's the City School District. It's the City of Rochester and the Gateways Music Festival. We determined that we can do more together than each of us doing our own things independently. And our goal was to be able to provide high quality music instruction, tuition free, in the hardest hit neighborhoods in Rochester. Rochester is divided into 4 quadrants. I'm really excited to say we just opened our 3rd school in the 3rd of the 4 quadrants in January. These are in community centers. And so students are meeting there 3 days a week for after-school music instruction, starting 1st grade through 12th grade. Our goals for the students are, 1, simply to experience the joy of music making. The second is for these students to stay in school. In Rochester, for the first time in decades, the city school district has the highest graduation rate in several decades. It's now 51%. And that's an appalling figure. We know that students who are in music stay in school. One of our goals is for the students to be accepted to the School of the Arts, the city school district program, because the graduation rate in that school is 89%. We want these students to stay in school and to graduate and to love music. And the third goal is for those who really do love music and aspire to learn more. We want to give them the opportunity for advanced study both at Eastman and the Hochstein School of Music. That leads to another program we have, which is called Eastman Pathways. Eastman Pathways provides 65 full tuition scholarships to the community music school for lessons, ensembles, and classes. Upon graduation, if the student is accepted to Eastman, that full scholarship will stay with them through Eastman. So since 1997, we've had more than 200 students graduate from that program. 100% of them have graduated from high school. 89% of them have gone on to college. Of those, 43% of them majored in music. And of those, 10% of them have gone to Eastman. So the last thing I want to say about this is now that we're in our 5th year of rock music, we will graduate our first students from that from high school into college in 2 years. I believe that we will see the numbers of our pathway students increase pretty significantly at that time. I'm confident that making a significant and substantial impact requires a decades-long commitment, and we are into this for decades. There are no short-term answers, but we are going to remain committed to build this. Second, we are now really working to see how can we take this program that touches a few hundred students and enliven a 32,000 student school district. That's where we can start to have a real impact. We need to increase the number of students who are experiencing the joy of making music. And finally, we think that rock music is a model that can be replicated. Every city has collegiate music programs, community music programs, professional music organizations, city government, a city school district. Again, I think that it is a fact that these things that we see happening in other cities, the collective effort is more powerful than the same number of individual efforts. So that's a start. Again, I feel like it's progress, but it's not enough, and we all need to be invested in this.
Thank you. Let me skip to something a little bit different. When I was a student, I felt like a lot of the conversations around diversity and inclusion somewhat happened behind closed doors. And by behind closed doors, I mean basically at my apartment with the other 5 or 6 African-American students who went to Curtis. And I noticed that those similar conversations were happening at other schools. When we would meet at a place like Sphinx, for example, we would talk about this, and we had this commonality and thought that it was difficult to share those things with the faculty and the administration. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what your schools are doing to help facilitate an honest conversation between students, faculty, and administration.
Sure. So in my opening remarks, though brief, one of the things that I think is really important about what Manhattan School of Music is doing is trying to develop a culture where the conversations can happen. And I was so moved by Katie Wyatt's lead yesterday of Dare to Dialogue. So at MSM, there are several ways this dialogue has manifested. Prior to my arrival, the leadership, both on the administrative side, starting with the President's Council, as well as our Faculty Council of Chairs, which are the 19 department heads, went through a robust training experience 2 years ago with a facilitator who works in social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion, is now at New York University, prior had been at Harvard. So someone who's very steeped in the research as well as the practice. And that really helped open the dialogue, I think, at the upper levels of the school. And for a lot of the those of you who have been here for the week, you understand that for change to happen, this is one of the areas where leadership needs to demonstrate, and the next panel will talk about walking the walk. The way that that then also is manifested in the other structures within the school is that we have a Black Student Union. We have more than a dozen student organizations that have mentors embedded within our staff and our faculty so that they too can have conversations that are not behind closed doors but rather supported specifically by our school. And then that information is oftentimes facilitated to my office or other leaders within the school because we have joint meetings. So we don't want, again, it's one thing to be able to facilitate the conversations, but if the conversations figuratively stay behind closed doors, even within the walls of the school, and they're not crossing the vertical structure of the school, then it doesn't give us the opportunity to think about how we can improve. The other thing I would say that I have found to be absolutely remarkable and was really one of the pulls for me to find myself eager and anxious to join the Manhattan School of Music when offered the position is that there is this very deep integration of the efforts of inclusion and equity found throughout the ethos of the mission statement all the way into the curriculum. So I'll just touch on one more short example to illuminate this, and that is that we have an community outreach program that is not siloed, it is not elective, but rather embedded into the curriculum, in which our students, particularly those at the graduate level in the master's program, will be able to have training, and we bring experts into the classroom before they then have experiential learning in New York public city schools, so that our students are prepared, if they haven't yet had this experience, that our students are prepared to not only have the dare to dialogue conversations in a safe classroom environment with their peers, but then are better prepared to enter approximately 20 New York City schools where we serve approximately 2,300 students. And the point that I'll maybe finish with on this question is that for me, one of the most important opportunities that we have is to have sustained interactions with students. This is not parachute into a school one day and then a week later be in another school. And so this deep penetration of having partnerships with 20 schools and 2,300 students that week by week, month by month, year by year, our MSM students are building relationships and fostering an opportunity to express to young New York City public school students that if this is a path that they see for themselves, whether it's as the artist or as the consumer of our art, that they have early role models in their life of what this will look like and how that might translate for them.
Excellent, thanks. Ara, I was going to pose the next question to you about Juilliard potentially having a completely inclusive strategy. What positions the school to be more inclusive? You touched a little bit before on the MAP program, which has been around for quite a while, I've been involved with. But I think one thing that a lot of people are probably curious about in this audience is how does inclusivity go beyond programming? Right. Because one of the things that we oftentimes talk about is we see institutions oftentimes, they'll say, well, we have this particular program or we have this particular office. For example, you mentioned the hiring of a new EDIB officer. But what the conversations here revolve around oftentimes is that diversity and inclusion is not a one-off thing that can be taken care of with a weekly program or a Saturday program or something, but in fact, systemic bias and racism or white privilege or whatever you want to call it is something that's kind of baked into everything that exists, whether it's the way that the marketing occurs, the way that the scholarship process occurs, the admissions. We were talking earlier off to the side about filling out your admissions papers. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys are doing, or the questions that you're asking yourselves?
I think that the key question is exactly the question you asked, and the real answer is constant awareness and questioning, and you know what I lovingly call, we've been interviewing for the dean of the preparatory division, and if we succeed, what we're looking for is what I jokingly call the unified field theory, a really comprehensive view rather than these segmented views. And I think the measure of success will be how consistent it is, our approach is across all aspects of Juilliard's life. Because if it is isolated, and if it is segmented, and if it is this program, I think having the EDIB officer in the president's office signals at a very tangible level that this has attention at the highest level, and it befits everyone to buy in. And very many similar things to what Joyce is describing. Juilliard, for many years, has had this philosophy of the artist as citizen. And what does that mean? And if you're a fully engaged citizen, you can't be a fully engaged citizen without being honest about every question you just asked. I just want to give the example that Weston cited, just as how you constantly have to think about obstacles. In a school like ours, where there is a number of faculty you can choose from, in the application process, there's a drop-down menu in which you can click on which teacher you want as your first choice. And if you're in a situation where you're well-networked and your teacher had a teacher who currently teaches at Juilliard, or you're at Interlochen and have terrific college guidance counselors, or places with resources, you might have a clear line of thought about what teacher is right for you. But if you're not in a setting like that, it's like spinning a roulette wheel, choosing the teacher. And only in the last couple of weeks, as we began to talk about this, we asked ourselves, that is really forbidding to a student who's not informed about these teachers. And we're about to add in that drop-down menu, I would like advisement about my choice of teacher. It's small, but it's large. That opens room for further conversation and question, and sends a signal that there's room for that conversation. You're not assumed to know that, you know, this trombone teacher is for you. And it's that kind of constant questioning at every action. And I think eventually, I mean, we're looking at implicit bias training as a follow-up to a first-round listening survey we did with the community on EDIB issues, and taking a serious look not just at the admissions process, but we began to talk just before we came out about the audition process. What happens when we really start questioning the audition process about what shadings and perspectives are there that we assume and take for granted, and that they themselves may be obstacles.
Right. Speaking of the audition process, by the way, just for the room, we're a couple of minutes away from being at the halfway point. So I'm going to throw out one more question, and then we'll go to the audience and ask questions from in person and from Slido. So don't worry, that portion is definitely coming. But going along with the idea of the audition process, one other question I wanted to pose, and I'll throw it out to Jamal, is what kind of work are you doing, or questions have you thought about with regards to talent identification? Because I think about, if I can go back to when I was a high school student, I was thinking about colleges. One of the things that I mentioned to Ara just out in the hallway is that as a senior in high school, I decided to audition at Indiana University and the University of Michigan. And the reason why I chose those two schools is because that's what US News and World Report had listed as two of the best schools in the country. It wasn't because I had an awareness of all these different schools and who was teaching there, what was going on. It wasn't that I had a private teacher, because I didn't take private lessons when I was a junior high or high school student. And I eventually ended up going to Curtis, but when I was in high school, Curtis and Juilliard were not on my radar at all. And so the idea is that there are a lot of talented kids out there, and what are the schools doing to make sure that they're finding those students and making them aware of what your institutions have to offer?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, and it's tricky because music school recruitment in general is multifaceted. There's no one thing, right? There is faculty directed, there's school directed, there's so many different things that happen. It's individualized and it's also sort of corporate. I think one of the first things we do to find talent really comes from faculty. Faculty members at every school are not only teaching on their faculties, they're teaching at summer institutes, they're out giving master classes, they give recitals, they become exposed to students. And that relationship is a really key relationship. Sometimes that starts in 8th or 9th grade. And a faculty member will, sort of stay in touch with a student until they're auditioning for college. That's somewhat effective for those students who are, as you just said, sort of in the right circumstances, that have programs that are sending students to those kind of programs. There's a whole realm of students who don't have that access, so that gets trickier. I think one of the things is just what an admissions office does to cast a wide net. So again, they attend college fairs, they visit arts high schools, they participate in panel presentations. They try to make certain that each school's name is getting out there to the widest audience of people. Some specific things that we do, and we know many of our peer schools do, we sponsor faculty visits to targeted schools. So for instance, the Merit School in Chicago, we will make certain we have faculty who are going there. Booker T. Washington High School in Dallas. It's a fantastic music program. So we want those students to get to know our faculty members. We also have sort of general admissions visits where the admissions office goes. So places like the Baltimore School of the Arts, LaGuardia High School, Houston School of Performing Arts. Again, these are already students who are, quote, in the system. And so they're somewhat easier to target than those who, again, may not be in private lessons or not be as aware. A final thing I'd say is that, for a number of years, Eastman, Juilliard, and Ithaca College have joined together, and they've gone out and given sort of joint admissions presentations, trying to counsel people on how to both navigate the college admission process, financial aid, but also how to find the school that is the right, quote, fit for what a given student is looking at. I think those kind of partnerships and again, working together to make certain that the right students end up at the right school is a really healthy thing. So those are some of the things that we're doing. We know our peers are out there doing the same sort of things.
Fantastic, thanks. All right, so I think we can go to questions from the audience now. We've got a long list of things on Slido, but I know there was someone standing here at the podium or at the microphone who wanted to ask. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Hola, my name is Carlos Garcia Leon, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Cincinnati in Arts Administration in an MBA program. And I wanted to ask what or if any of your institutions are doing to get students, especially your students of color, to start thinking or start the path to get into the positions that you hold. And I ask that because while I do believe that you all can be accomplices to what I call DICE, which is diversity, inclusion, and cultural equity. And just to clarify, I say cultural equity because I don't want anyone to forget that other cultures are humans and not just a source of earned income or like contributing income for later donors or foundations. But because I asked because as Dr. Griggs said, and you mentioned that like leadership should have people of color. So I'm just, and I never see information from institutions like yours to get students to start thinking about the path that led you to where you are.
That's a great question. In terms of perhaps our journeys that led us here, I find that a lot of times it's my investment in wanting to be known to the students. So I'm at a lot of concerts, I'm at a lot of master classes. I try to hold open office hours for students or invite students to come and see me. So one thing is there's the informal mentorship, I think, that can come from that. The other is specifically at Manhattan School of Music, in order to try and open one's mind to what the various possibilities of a career can be, is that all of our students are required to complete a certain number of attendances to a program called Setting the Stage. And this is something that happens at various points throughout a curriculum at the undergraduate and graduate level. And through the Setting the Stage workshops and events, we actually have a host of speakers who will come and talk to students and then interact with them, much in the way that this event is happening right now. So one was in November, the president of the Manhattan School of Music and I and our graduate coordinator for the DMA program were a panel, and we spoke much like this for about 15 or 20 minutes in an hour-long session, and then we opened it up to the students and said, what do you want to know? And to your point, a lot of them wanted to know, what is our journey? But one of the most important takeaways that we hope you will all understand is that every person's path is unique, and that you find the mentors and the people you can call upon for advice, so that as you're moving through your career, which will be likely more circuitous than not, you can navigate those choices as they come up.
I have, there are several questions that have come up on Slido that I think are worth asking. And I have to say, reading some of these questions, it's one of the things that makes me love this conference, because people are so honest and straightforward. But I want to throw some of these out here. The question that has the most likes, and it's largely a statement and partially a question, says, I'm challenged by the fact that a panel designed to explore dismantling of the status quo only includes the top institutions, quote unquote top institutions, and 2 white men. What gives? And I think that also relates to, I'll try to put a couple of these questions together. There was another one, it said, I was talking about, when recruiting faculty and administrators of color, do you look at HBCUs rather than other Western institutions? And there was another one, and I'll find in a second, that was talking about what do we do to increase diversity amongst the administration? We talk a lot about programs to help diversity with students, but what are we doing for programming to help diversity of faculty, admin, things like that?
So if I could take that, I think it's the first question is just an exceptional question. And again, you look at this, you know, we're talking about this, and we have 3 Caucasian panelists and 2 white men. I'm struck when I go to NASM, the National Association of Schools of Music, and there are 1,300 or 1,400 people there. It is still largely an old white guy conference, and I'm right there with them. And I look at even diversity in terms of women leadership, right? Women in our school, more than 50% of our students are female, but far fewer than 50% of the leaders of music schools are women. So what do we do, and who's going to do that? So I think it's whoever has a heart to participate that and is welcome. And whether it's a white man or a person of color, I think that we have to do this together. I think it's a huge problem that we face, and we have to encourage ways to do that. What can we do to diversify the administration of our schools? And I think that's an important element. I said 10 years ago, you know, we really started focusing on faculty diversity. I would tell you we've made little progress there. You know, I've doubled it from 1 to 2. Whew. That's nothing. But I can create an administrative position. I can't just create a new trombone position. So, you know, we've done that. We've created a position because, you know, I met an individual a few years ago who I thought, this is an exceptional human being, a kind of thinker I want to be associated with our school, and somebody who I very much want to work with. So we created a position, a senior advisor to the dean. And with that, you know, didn't search for it. I really created a position so that I could hire Lee Kuntz as part of my administrative team. And that's one small thing we can do, but it is step by step to get there.
Excellent. I have one more, and then we'll come back to the questions in the audience. It says, are you doing anything at your institutions to teach the importance of DEI to the white student body? How do we convince them to get on board with this as well?
Well, none of these programs are meaningful if they don't include all of the students. And so the conversation has to be a constant, and all of the programs we talked about has to include all of the students. And I just also want to echo just the obvious and acknowledge the very slow progress towards that end. You know, we spent the first half hour talking about students, but if we don't succeed on the faculty and administration level, I mean, everything has to be a comprehensive look, and the question has to inform every decision that's made at every level. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that as we talk about diversifying student body, that question includes administration and faculty.
Right. Yeah, I think it's one of those things we should all challenge ourselves to think about is, we have conferences like the Sphinx conference, right? And different schools are here, and a lot of those schools bring a large percentage of their African American, Latin American students to these conferences. But I think one of the things that the person who asked this question was thinking of is actually, in a lot of ways, this would be the perfect conference to bring a lot of the white students to. Because it's oftentimes viewed as this is our problem to deal with or something that we need to solve, but it's also something that's really an issue for everybody. You know, the idea of inequality is not something that only makes our own lives more difficult, but it actually makes the humanity of everyone else less as well. So I even think about my colleagues in the Met Orchestra. You know, I'm one of the small number of people who attend the conference, and I'm thinking, all of my white colleagues really should be here. In fact, in many ways, it would be much more meaningful and important for them to be here than it is for me to be here. And just another side before we get to another question, we'll go to this side here in a second, is I was talking to some of my colleagues about, and friends here, about a lot of the great literature that's been coming out recently, like Ta-Nehisi Coates' the Between the World and Me, and how many well-intentioned white people are so troubled by this book, and how every black person who's read the book says, yeah, that's how it goes. That's the deal. And I think it would just be a really, really meaningful step in the field if we saw a lot more non-minority people coming to these conferences and engaging in these conversations, and not just the leaders of the organizations, but the students and the staff and everyone else. But at any rate, let's go on to another question over here.
Hi, I'm Richard. I'm a PhD student at Eastman in music theory. Don't get scared, everybody here's music theory, but actually that's what my question is regarding, particularly with curriculum. What are your institutions, I'm at school with Dean Rossi, but what are your institutions doing with regard to particularly music theory and music history, instead of just saying we're offering a course in African American music or history or anything like that, but really baking it into everything that a student does? I know for myself, I went to Howard, and I had black professors that talked about black music when they were talking about music theory, but instead of you having a separate course for it, when we learn 20th century music, you don't learn composers like William Grant Still and things like that. When you learn music theory, you don't learn about these things, you learn about music by European composers for most of the time you're there. So when you have a program, even if you program black music into your program, these things that are biased against these composers and things that might appear racist or anything like that, I feel like it's justified within music theory when you don't talk about these things. So again, what are your institutions doing in order to increase that within the canon in the classroom?
Great question.
Great question.
Thank you, Richard, for that question. In fact, on Monday, I'm meeting with the curriculum committee of our faculty, and this is a very question I'm going to pose to them. It's easy in higher ed for us to think about adding another course, but the more we talk about inclusivity, the more it resonates with me as a leader of one of the premier conservatories, is that this has to be integrated. And it cannot be something that sits in an isolation in one class that might only serve 30 or 40 students at the most in a given semester. It has to be deeply rooted. And to go back to the ethos of the School of Manhattan School of Music is that perhaps because of where we're situated, perhaps because we were started to serve immigrant children 100 years ago, that this really is baked in already in many ways to what our value set is. It bears out into the mission statement and the vision statement and value statement, and it finds its way onto the stage, but it's still a very small piece of what we would think of as truly being a gold standard, if you will, of what inclusivity should look like. And so to all of our points I think we're making is that we are slowly and maybe at times more quickly making changes, but it is something that we have to think about with intention. And if it's not thought about with intention, if it's not stated, if it's not written down as a core value that all of us can say every decision that we make will be informed through the lens of these principles, then it becomes easier to let a new course slide when it's proposed or it's revised, to just continue to marginalize things that need to be front and center within the curriculum that our students experience. And that's what we're trying to do at MSM.
Does anybody else want to address that?
I just want to say that, first of all, I so agree with what you said, Joyce. And I think one of the things that I've noticed that's changed is the sense of momentum.
Right.
Again, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was almost a sense that this is something being imposed top-down from the president to the institution or from the outside in. Today, I get a sense that so much of it is self-directed by students, by faculty, that people want to be invested in this. So, Richard asked a great question, but what you may or may not know, at Eastman 2 or 3 years ago, the musicology faculty blew up the music history curriculum of their motivation, that we no longer teach music history, from the beginning to 1750, 1750 to 2000, or 1900, 1900 beyond. It's now topical. The role of improvisation in music history, the role of music in society, all kind of topics which suddenly open up areas of music history we haven't typically talked about. The last thing I'd say is there's a colleague of Richard's that created a website that said, for every element of music theory, here's musical excerpts by women composers that you could use to teach this concept. Because all of the music and all of our theory courses, tend to be standard pieces that we know almost exclusively by male composers. So, it's a remarkable website she did on her own as part of her PhD. To say, French sixth chord, here's a piece by a women composer, here's the exact excerpt. And those kind of initiatives, I think the momentum is positive, and we're going to see more and more of those things.
Just a quick answer, because I think you're absolutely right, Richard, and the conversation is beginning, and the question is an extremely pertinent one. The one encouragement I can say is just to echo Jamal, is that it is accelerating this conversation and intensifying. And some of the measure of that, I was really heartened by the opening session, both by Earl Lewis's speech and his faith in time and change and manifesting itself over time, but also just the fact of this conference. When this conference began, it was an unlikely kind of idealistic venture, and we're now in a gathering of 800 people in the work of the Sphinx Conference, and every question like this ripples right back, and the challenge is on us to respond and respond accordingly. It is accelerating.
I wanted to say really quickly before we go to the next question, we'll come over here. Richard, I loved your question, and I think about what you're saying all the time from the perspective that as a young African-American student, even just in junior high and high school, if I look back on that and I think to myself, what was I taught about Black history as it relates to American history? And what I think a lot of us are taught, and a lot of things that we learn later that frustrates us, is that we were taught that we had no history, or that our history was compartmentalized into one or two small spaces, whether that's MLK or one random Black composer, and that's the whole thing, or one particular class. And the idea is that throughout the entire history of music, there's been great African and Latin music, and there have been great ideas. Or we hear the concept that we would love to do things by more Black and brown composers, but there's not any good music available. And that begs the question, well, who determines what is good? And it kind of gets integrated into the question of, someone asked, what are we doing to build internal competency and capacity amongst the staff and faculty on issues related to DEI? And I think that's one of the things that people are concerned about. If we had more people who were in the positions of authority and had the agency to make these decisions, that a lot of these concerns would be more easily addressed. But at any rate, can we go over here?
Garrett McQueen. So from my perspective, one of the worst parts of the status quo in classical music is the idea that there are top orchestras or top institutions. I'm wondering if you think your institutions can play a role in dismantling the idea that Eastman and Juilliard are the paths to a profession in classical music.
it's actually a burden to be considered that, and we are very careful never to refer ourselves in that way, to refer to ourselves in that way. And my interest in any conversation, I've actually asked students of ours, do you want to attend Juilliard or do you want to be a musician? What's the priority here? Because I mean, it's not a close call in my mind. It's about becoming a musician in all of that means. So I think it's really important for us, all of us, not to reinforce that message in subtle ways or obvious ways, and make clear that the value here is a life in the arts and a life of service in the arts and a life of engagement as an artist. It's not about, I actually really am uncomfortable when I'm dealing with a student who regards their admission as a kind of trophy experience and try to get them to think more broadly. It's a burden to carry that association, and that association actually can become a bit of a limitation when a student says, that's not for me because it's, you know, somewhere up here. And so we have to counter that in everything we do.
Hey, sorry. My name is Marquis Wincher. I'm a student at the New England Conservatory. And so my question is, when are we going to, move past the commodification of diversity? For instance, like, as a student, I feel really included in the marketing department. Like, I feel like the 4 black faces at the school are like the main ones I see, but then, as far as like the institution as a whole, I don't feel really included. For instance, like, if you want to see more black art or minority art around the school, right, that's difficult to get accomplished. A lot of my classes are predominantly white, and sometimes I'll be the only black person sitting in a class, and sorry, so like, professors will be, they're not always the most culturally aware, and they'll say things that might be okay in a room completely full of white people, but I'm like, I'm the one black person, I'm like, okay, this is not okay with me in the room, So I'm wondering, when are we going to be more inclusive inside of the institution, not just inclusive in the sense of trying to attract more diversity?
It's a great question. I wish I had an answer for that. We started a diversity committee when we started this faculty recruitment phase about 10 years ago. And at that time, we said, if in 10 years we still have a diversity committee, we have a problem. Here we are 10 years later. Again, it's very slow. I think it is about the community that each school, each department builds for itself. And I know that we think often about community and being inclusive of all. Whether we're effective or not, I can't say that, but I know that's something we talk about all the time. At our university, the University of Rochester, there's an interim president who's been focused on creating a culture of respect. It's not about diversity, it's not about inclusion, it's respect of all people, all members of our community. I hope that over time that will accomplish just what you're saying, but I'm not sure what the specific steps are, or, quote, when will that happen?
I echo Jamal's sentiment that this is, it's troubling, and when I think about this work, some of the things that I look back on that I'm most proud of during my 3 years at CIM, though brief, is that we did a really deep dive of who are we. And when you look at yourselves as an institution and all of a sudden you see the staggering truth that from students to faculty and staff to the programming and the conductors who are in front of you do not represent anything that mirrors the community that you live in, that allows you to wake up and stop letting an institution hold on to these myths of we're here to train students in a very specific way, and unless they get this canon, then they're not going to be successful. And I'm proud to say that although those conversations were difficult and hard, it began a dialogue that continues to this day, and this year has led to the most diverse programming that the orchestra has done, as well as the most diverse number of conductors who are coming. And I hope that then that begins to illuminate the conversation in the classroom, because it is not fair for you to have to feel as though you're the only voice. And I hope that as we continue the dialogue with our own respective institutions, that the student conversation, the faculty, the leadership can all start to have this intersectionality that will allow for us all to have the conversation rather than it just being one person's responsibility.
I have a quick question. How many of you are immediately available after this session is over? Okay, because we're out of time. I got this big red screen in front of me, but I understand that everyone's question is really important. So maybe we can step out into a hallway or something like that, or out here in the lobby area. And everyone who has more questions and still wants to continue this conversation, we can continue doing that for a while, so that we make sure that everything that everyone's talking about gets addressed.
And
okay?
the next session is also very much
Yes.
on this conversation
Okay.
with
Yes.
other colleagues as well.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.